So the next thing in the IP addressing part, we'll be discussing on the difference between the private and the public IP addresses. Now, whatever the IP addresses we can use, those addresses are actually divided into two categories. One is in the private IP address, and other one which are public IPs which can be used on the internet. So let's try to see the difference between the private and the public IP. But before that, let's try to understand why there is a need for a private and the public IP addresses. So take an example. In my company, I got a LAN here, and in this LAN, it is connecting to some service provider, my ISP, and from this ISP, it's again connecting to some of my internet. And on the internet, I have public servers hosted. Now my user sitting here in my company, let's say the IP address of this user is 192.168.1.1, is trying to access the Yahoo server which is on the internet. So to access the Yahoo server, he need to open some URL, and then type the URL path, open a website, open a web browser, and then type the URL path www.yahoo.com. So the request goes to the router, and the router forwards back to ISP, and ISP finds where is the Yahoo server, and the Yahoo server has to reply back. But now the question is, when you talk about internet, so internet is something where everyone is connected, every ISP, every organization is connected. So there is a possibility that there are some multiple users on the internet on a different location, different country, different region, completely also might be using the same IP address. So there is a possibility because the IP addressing is standardized for everyone. So there is a possibility that there might be multiple users with the same IP. So the Yahoo server has to reply back to 192.168.1.1. But now the question is, will it reply back to this user somewhere here, or this user, or this user, or this user, or this user, or to no one, or to everyone? Because the communication happens completely based on IP addresses. So the source IP address is 192.168.1.1, and the Yahoo server has to reply back to 192.168.1.1. But the problem is there are multiple users. There might be multiple users with the same IP address. Now, how to overcome this kind of issues? So to fix this kind of issues, then we have something called public IP address. So what they did, they have classified the addresses, and they said that if you want to go to internet, you need to use a registered public IP address. So which means if this user want to go to internet, he need to go with some public IP 5111, let's say, example. And then when this user want to go to internet, he will go with some public IP, some 100.1.1.1, and this user will go with some other IP. And the good thing about this IP is it is globally unique. Now this IP will be globally unique, which means once this IP address is registered with this company or with this user, it will be with this user as long as he pays. You know, we can register some IP addresses, public IP with us, and it will be globally unique. It will not be given to anyone, and they are registered IP addresses. Okay, so every user, when they go to internet, they need to purchase the public IPs. So these IPs are not free of cost. You need to pay to the service provider or to INA to get these public IPs. Okay, so but the question is, what about the users who don't want to connect to internet but they still want to communicate? So, okay, so within my company, let's say I got one more branch office here, and I want this branch office and these two branch offices should communicate with each other without internet. So for this kind of connections, they have reserved some addresses called private addresses. Now the private addresses are opposite to public. They are actually not reserved addresses. Like I got a difference in the table here. Now the private addresses are not recognized on the internet, which means you can use within your company, within your LAN or within your company, and this is something the administrator will decide what addresses it should be used. It will be unique but within my organization, which means if I'm using 192.168.1.1, so there might be some user in a different country or different region or different organization also using the same IP. So there won't be any problem because we are not talking to each other directly, so there won't be any problems. and they are like a free IPs. You don't need to register. They are unregistered IP addresses. Okay, so within the LAN, within your company, if you're planning or designing any networks, we can use this private networks. Okay, so private addresses. If you want to go to internet, you need to have a public IP which is recognized on the internet, and you have to contact the service provider and you have to pay to the service provider to get that, and it will be globally unique. So it will be only one, and it is a registered IP addresses. So that's how they are classified, the addresses for different purposes, for within the company, within the organization, or if you want to go to internet. But what if there might be some cases where you might be using some private IP addresses, and I want these private users also want to talk to my other branch office here, and also they should be able to access internet. In that case, what I should do? So there is a solution for that. What we can do is we can allow these private IP addresses to go here, and the router, it can be router or firewall, also can do that. It can translate your private IP to go as a public IP address. So we can translate our private users, so they will go as a private here, but when they go here to ISP, they can get translated to a public IP address, and they can send a request to the Yahoo server, and they can reply back with a public IP. Now this Yahoo server will identify this request as a public IP, and they can translate it back to a private IP address. Now this process we call as network address translation. So we have a separate session, separate class dedicated for NAT, network address translation, where we'll see how to translate a private to public IP addresses, and what are the different methods we can use to translate your private to public address, like static NAT, dynamic NAT, and PAT. We'll see more in detail on the NAT as we go ahead. But here there is a classification of private and public IP addresses. So the private addresses are the addresses which can be used within your organization, and whereas the public addresses are the addresses which can be used to communicate or to connect to internet. Okay. So got the differences. So the private and public IP addresses, there is a classification of addresses. But now the question is how to identify the private addresses or public addresses. So they have given some range. There are certain addresses which are reserved as a private addresses. So in the A class, you know the range of A class, it starts from 1 to 126, because we cannot use 0, we cannot use 127. Total there are 1 to 126 in the A class. In that complete, there is only one network, that is 10.x. Anything starting with 10 is your private network, remaining all are your public networks. Now similar way even in the B class, the range is 128 to 191, which means you can take 128.0 combination like that. If you take, there are around 16,384 networks we get, very big network, and each and every network will have 65,000 addresses. But out of that, only 16 networks are private. So anything starting from 172.16 to 172.31. So which means 172.16, 17, 18, 19 up to 31. So only these networks are private. So you need to remember this range of addresses. When we design our networks, probably we prefer to use the private IP addresses within your organizations. Now similar way, in case of C class, anything starting with 192, 168, anything starting with 192, 168 will be identified as your private IP addresses, and anything other than that will be always referred as public addresses. So public IP addresses are very big. It's a very big range. So it's not easy for us to identify. So that's the reason what we do here is we need to remember the private IP address range, and then anything within this range referred as a private IP addresses, and anything beyond this range will be identified as public addresses. So let's take some example here. So what I'll do is I'll take one example to differentiate 172.35.10.10. Now my question is, this address belongs to a private IP or public IP? So it's a public address. The reason is anything between 16 to 31 is your private. It is 35, beyond 31, so it will be a public address. So anything coming within this range, you need to understand them as private IP addresses. Anything beyond this range will be identified as public addresses. So the allocation of the private and the public addresses is done by INA, Internet Assigned Number Authority. So that's the authorized government agency to look after the allocation of the public IPs, and the complete allocation of these IPs has been divided into different 5 regions. Based on that 5 regions, so this is your Asia Pacific region, and to have some more information on this, you can visit the ina.org website. You can go to ina.org. So there you'll find all this information here. If you just scroll down here a little bit, so IP addresses and AS numbers, you can see these are the 5 regions. So Africa region, Asia Pacific region, here you can see Asia Pacific region, this is my Africa region, and then North America region, Latin America, and then these regions. So we call them as 5 regions, and if you click on these specific links to get into more information, just click on this link. It will redirect your specific region website, and there you can find some information, or if you want to get some IP addresses, you can contact them. And here you will see this is a link which will take you ina.org assignments IPv4 address space. Now it's going to show you the list of the different assignments, like if you just come down a little bit here, the 10-dot network, with the 28/8 subnet mask, this is for private purpose. This is your 10.x.x.x network. And then 11-dot network is for Department of Defense Intel Information System. Like that, the different blocks are registered, like 23 block is registered for this region wise. Similar way, this 36 block is reserved for APNIC, Asia Pacific region, like that. These are all the allocations you will find on the website. Not really important, not really required to know, but just a general information to know that this INA is going to assign already this address in different regions. So if I'm in this region, so I need to the local service provider will contact the specific region to get some public IP addresses, and then this service provider will allocate to small service providers. From there, again, the customer will get those public IP addresses. So if you are running a big size company, you can even contact the big service providers or INA or the authorized registry to get your public IP addresses.